I am a grandparent of a child with moderate to severe autism, and I started working with him from the day he was diagnosed at 3 years of age. He's now 17. So I'll use some of my examples, I'll use my experience with him and how we were successful in advocacy with the things that he needed.
Parents, associations, and agencies interviewed for the stakeholder study agreed that one of the key challenges for parents is the constant need to advocate for their children.
I am going to draw heavily on the work of Professor Hoffer, who wrote a book entitled Advocacy Practice for Social Justice.
Advocacy is a systematic way to defend, represent, or advance the cause of another. It confronts discrimination, oppression, and institutional inequalities.
This is just an example of something that happened in the school system. He can't sit still during circle time, and this is what the parents said to the teacher. So we can institute all the sticker charts you want. He's just going to feel like a failure because he didn't get a sticker. You're asking him to do something he cannot do. So the frustration, the mother says here, is having to educate others about his needs so that they're being proactive instead of punitive because of his disabilities. He looks like he's trying to be defiant and not cooperative.
Barriers include exclusion from education. Okay? We just don't have that here. Or our waiting lists are so long that your child will grow up before they ever get into service. And we also have poverty issues. Now, what can you do when you can't get to the service because you don't have transportation to get there? I don't know how many families and groups have told me the real importance of advocacy is to give people hope. Because with hope, they feel they can conquer other things, they can do other things.
I'm thinking of one little guy called Louis. His mother's a pretty experienced parent, but he really is quite severe FAS. And about 13 years old, they went to the local drugstore to get him a job. He got the job. Next day, the drugstore calls, they've got the police there. And so she goes over, Louis stolen a chocolate bar. He hadn't even started the job. And so she explained that he had FAS and all the rest of the policemen, and he said, oh, well, that's too bad. He said, you know, well, we'll let this one go because he's learned from this experience, hasn't he? Won't do it again. She said, not likely. And then she educated the policeman. She educated the pharmacy, and he was able to keep his job.
So what are some of the strategies we can use to change if we're not already a strong advocate? First of all, we must be educated about our rights. You can't learn everything at once, but you need to start learning about the rights of your child and the rights of your family and what legislation is associated with. You might be quite surprised to find that legislation is quite supportive, but when you go to look at the policy to implement the legislation, it is actually lacking or interpreted in a lesser fashion than it should be. You can achieve a strategy for change by being involved in support groups, lobbying government, from being involved in support groups, and advocating beyond your community on a provincial and national level.
Change also comes from working with disability organizations, which make program funding and development possible.
I wouldn't have gotten anywhere with my grandson in the early days of advocating for him if it had not been for disability organizations and professionals of like mind.
For parents, advocacy can go on for decades.
First of all, we have to advocate for a diagnosis. We need the diagnosis because the system operates on getting services with a diagnosis. To me, a diagnosis is a double-edged sword. I need it to get what I want, but on the other hand, once I get the diagnosis, I tend to forget about try to forget about the diagnosis because I want to interact with that person as a person and not by their diagnosis. We need services. In many cases, we're not going to get them unless we advocate on our own behalf. It's the same with respite. We need to take care of ourselves. We need to have our family members, grandparents, aunts and uncles, siblings understand the disability better. Schools, of course, once the child starts schools, then we have to start advocating with the school. And then socially, we have to advocate for programs for our children as well. I'm just thinking of my grandson, and I'm thinking that we successfully implemented programs where there were no programs by advocating for pilot programs. And he jumped from pilot program to pilot program all through school. So that's how we got services for him.
Successful advocacy takes some preliminary homework. It's important first to get involved and to fully understand what the issues are and who is affected.
Advocacy is always done with and for a person with disabilities and not to. So we always have to keep that in the back of our mind. Get your facts. Don't let anybody trip you up in an advocacy meeting because you don't have your basic facts. You don't have to be an expert in everything, but you do have to have some facts to back you up. When planning for advocacy, consider 4 questions. What do you want? Who can get you what you want? The target. Okay? When can or should you act? Certainly after you do a lot of planning and get some information. And how can you act to get what you want? Develop some strategies when you go into the meeting with the target. Take an advocate with you. Take a husband, take a wife, take a brother, an uncle, whatever. But take somebody. Don't go alone, because if you're the parent of the child, you can likely get emotional, and it might interfere with some of your strategies.
Be prepared with solutions to present to decision makers and positive arguments to counter any resistance.
I wrote down this example, which I said to one official one time. This would really make you look good. People will genuinely appreciate your actions. And if you're talking to an ambitious person, that might influence them.
You won't get everything you want, so be ready to accept alternatives. Think about the worst you're willing to accept. If you're offered less, walk away. Ask for more than you expect to get, so there's room for negotiation. And don't cave in too soon.
People will usually do something when they realize you're going to continue to be polite, continue to be professional, but you're never going to go away until something's resolved. So if you have a professional that you're working with, always keep them up to date with what you're doing. Because you never know, they may give you some information from inside the system as well to help what you're doing. Don't waste time with uncommitted people.
Advocacy is never really over. It's important to note not only your successes, but your failures as a way to improve your approaches to advocacy.
Okay, you expected to get somewhere, but you were disappointed. Why? What happened? Write it down, because that strategy you may change next time. You might not get there this year, you might not get there next year, but you might get there in 5 years.